Good morning. How is everybody? Good. Slide this forward. This is my normal dance routine at the start of a talk. Great. So as we heard from Matt, we're looking at 1 Kings 19. We're looking at Elijah's story and kind of the closing parts of. Is it ringing the microphone? Could you turn it down a bit? It's a bit too boomy, I feel like this morning. So we're looking at the kind of closing part of this kind of contest with Baal, this relationship with Ahab, the king that Elijah has. And we're going to pick up the story as we do in 1 Kings 19, kind of looking at kind of two of the greatest moments, really, that Elijah's had. We kind of come after these events on Mount Carmel, where God kind of shows up really powerfully and kind of burns the altar in front of the people and the prophets of Baal. There's this kind of contest on the side of the mountain. And then just after that, we learned about last week, Elijah kind of praying powerfully for rain to come after 7 times of trying, after years of drought. And we see God move and the rains begins. And it's really important to notice that this has happened just before this bit in 1 Kings 19. It would seem a bit strange to kind of read this in isolation, but it's important to understand not only the kind of chapter before, but also the kind of run up, what the Hebrew people have been through, what the Israelites have been through up until this point. And so I want to kind of quickly skip over some of the kind of key events. They've been through quite a lot since kind of, if you think, Egypt might have been the last time we kind of, one of our last anchors in their story, one of the things that we remember. And it's important to notice, that since then they've been through a lot of twists and turns. They left Egypt with Moses, if you remember the parting of the Red Sea and this story. They then settled after 40 years in the wilderness in the land of Canaan. And they had, pleaded with God for a leader, leaders, and God gave them the judges, who were people to remind, they were special people that reminded God's people of the law and of justice and the right way to live. And then the people really wanted a king. You might know this, it might be really familiar to you. The people really wanted a king, and so Saul became king. And after Saul, there was King David, wrote a lot of the Psalms, quite a popular king. And then his son, Solomon, who again we think of as wise and brilliant. Solomon then took over after David, and Solomon became old, and as he kind of became older, he slightly lost his way, started to kind of allow other gods into the picture alongside Yahweh, the God of Israel. And when Solomon died, there was essentially like a civil war, like a split in the country. We have these two kingdoms emerge. We have the northern kingdom, which carries on being called Israel, and then the southern kingdom is called Judah. So we have these two kingdoms, there are two kings, and there's a lot of kings in this period. Everything okay? Got it. There are a lot of kings in this period that are not good. There are a lot of kings in this period that worship other gods, allow other gods to be worshipped alongside Yahweh. One of these gods is Baal. Ahab and his wife Jezebel really like the god Baal, and allow him to be worshipped and encourage his worship in the northern kingdom of Israel. And so Elijah, his kind of whole thing is, like with all the prophets, he's calling God's people back to worshipping Yahweh alone, this God that led them out of Egypt, back to justice, back to the law. And we see in kind of chapter 18 this high point, as I said, on Mount Carmel. It seems like Elijah maybe is won. The prophets of Baal, we get rid of them, and Elijah has shown that God is the true God. And you can imagine Elijah's kind of high spirits. He has, in some ways, completed his life's calling. And so Elijah kind of rushes to Jezreel, the capital of the northern kingdom, And I can imagine that he's assuming that Ahab, the king, is ready to make some changes. You know, he's ready to get rid of Baal and the other gods and to bring Yahweh back into his rightful place. But then arriving back at this capital city, Jezreel, Jezebel, the wife of the king, threatens Elijah. And Elijah was scared. You know, this is a powerful, manipulative woman who's, she loves Baal, she hates Elijah, and she wants to, she threatens Elijah with death. And so Elijah hears this, and even though he has just experienced these great moments with God, he's afraid, and he flees, and he goes into the wilderness. And we've got some images. I've got some images of people going into the wilderness. Dun, dun, dun. They might look a bit strange. This is a fun thing. This is AI imaging. You put in words, and the computer produces an image that doesn't exist. If it freaks you out, that's okay. But this is, I typed in, like, man in cloak walks into wilderness, and it, like, made an image. Amazing, isn't it? I've got some more to show you a bit later on. And Elijah goes out into the wilderness. He's in a reasonably bad place. He's, tired. He's a bit scared. He kind of wants to give up. He doesn't want to carry on. And Elijah leaves, walks out into the wilderness, and he collapses under a bush and sleeps because he's exhausted. He's just travelled from Mount Carmel in the end of chapter 18. It says that he ran 30 kilometres, quicker than a chariot. Don't know that was that possible, but I guess with God, everything's possible. And then if you look at the distance between the capital Jezreel, the capital that he's just come from, and he travels all the way south to Beersheba. That's another 150 kilometres just in a couple of days. And then he goes out for a whole day's walk into the wilderness alone. Probably within like a few days, maybe a week, he's travelled about 200 kilometres on foot. He's probably pretty tired, and let alone like the threat to his life and the kind of emotional toll that the events must have had on him. He must have been pretty tired. So he lies down under a bush. Reb, if you want to get the Twitter image. This is a classic meme. I don't know if you're about to read it. A classic meme that comes up and goes around on social media quite regularly. This is your gentle reminder that one time in the Bible, Elijah was like, God, I'm so mad, I want to die. So God said, here's some food, why don't you have a nap? So Elijah slept, ate, and decided things weren't so bad. Never underestimate the spiritual power of a nap and a snack. I just think it's one of the best, most applicable Bible messages ever. And I think it's important. I mean, it's important to know that just for ourselves. I'm never myself when I'm hungry. I also live with a pregnant woman. I can tell you that a nap and a snack is just the way. It's just the way forward. When you're having a bad day, remember that that's a good spiritual act. And whenever that comes up on Facebook, I always have a little chuckle to myself. So Elijah's travelled far. He's tired. He's a bit disheartened. He's a bit scared. Lies down into this bush. Wakes up and God's provided him with food, which is incredible. It says there's actually a fire cooking bread. And you can imagine waking up to the smell of bread. You slept outside. Someone's cooked you food. It's just a perfect image. But Elijah's journey isn't finished. He travels then like another 300 kilometres, again on foot. And he travels to a place called Horeb, Mount Horeb, which is quite an important place in Israel. The story of the Israelites, the Hebrew story. It's the place where we think probably God met with Moses. It's probably the same place that we know as Horeb today. We don't know for sure, but we're fairly confident that this is the mountain that has great significance in the story of Exodus. Elijah travels there, probably knowing that Moses had met with God powerfully on this mountain. So he arrives there and he goes into a cave. And before kind of continuing with the story, I know we've read it already, and there's kind of these earthquakes and fires and winds. I want to just kind of slow down and zoom out a little bit. If we look at the mountain, this image, this is a very crudely oversimplified image. I don't know if Carmel and Horeb are the same height or perfect triangles, but they might be. I've never been. We have this kind of visual representation. So we've got 1 Kings 18, so the altars, the rain. There's like a high point for Elijah. He has, these kind of great victories. And in the middle here, we come down and Elijah's afraid because of Jezebel's threat. And as we'll see in a moment, there's this other moment where God really shows up. You could view this as Elijah's mood. You could view this as moments where Elijah really felt close to God, maybe. 100% Elijah must have had a moment where he was like, yes, on the mountain. Yes, can you believe it? God is amazing. But so quickly, within a few verses, Elijah is down at the bottom of this, afraid. Do you think he was remembering God in the same way then? And then in just a moment, we'll see, how Elijah meets with God again. And I wonder if you ever kind of identify with this pattern in your life. I wonder if you ever identify with Elijah's kind of this high point that Elijah had, and then one sentence, one small thing from a human, from another person, from a situation that we're in. One moment of criticism. Doesn't matter how hopeful and amazing the moment you've just had is, one little moment can take us down, can't it? It can take us away, it can distract us, one difficult conversation, one setback, and we forget the kind of whole story that we're part of. We forget the kind of miraculous, wonderful, amazing things that God has done. And so Elijah's down here in the pit. He has, he's not feeling good. He travels to Horeb, and here God moves powerfully. And God does this in a kind of quite dramatic way. If you think, we always say to ourselves, we'd love a sign from God. We'd love a writing in the sky. We'd love a kind of God to show up in a real way. Well, for Elijah, it's pretty real. First, there's this wind that shatters rocks. Imagine that, a wind that shatters rocks. And I wonder if Elijah had imagined what God would do to protect him. I wonder if Elijah had this kind of idea, I want God to be powerful and I want him to blow like a wind through the city of Jezreel and smash the houses up with wind. I wonder if Elijah had those kind of thoughts. I know that when I'm in this kind of down, afraid place, sometimes I want God to be this kind of big, angry force. I wonder if Elijah was kind of sitting there thinking, I want God to show up as this destructive force against the people who have wronged me. And next there's an earthquake. Do you think Elijah maybe wanted God to be big and terrible in this way? Maybe he wanted God to break everything, to shake everything up. Do you think he wanted God to move in this specific way? But the interesting thing about this, the earthquake and the wind and then the fire that comes, the terrible and destructive fire, if we look, we've got some more AI-generated images. Got one that's a bit harder to see maybe. It's hard to see on there, but there's like fire. Oh, yeah, there we go, there's a big fire. Just typed in, man stands in front of fire, and I don't know, something on it came up with that. Amazing. You could talk more about the technology a bit later, but Elijah's seeing these amazing, wonderful, scary acts of God, but it says, in the Bible, it says that God was not in the wind. It says that God was not in the earthquake. God was not in the fire. And the Bible continues, and then there's a fourth kind of act, there's a fourth thing that happens from God. There is this small voice, a whisper. The kind of sound that you have to be quite close to someone to hear. A sound that isn't particularly impressive, isn't majestic, doesn't really destroy enemies, doesn't, show great power. But the Bible tells us that God was in the whisper. That God wasn't in the wind, the earthquake, the fire, but that God was in the whisper. And I think this is one of the hardest tensions, the kind of hardest things to sit in as a Christian, the tension between God's great power and God's closeness. The kind of earthquake, stormy, fire God, if you like, that we know we have. There's lots of stories in the Bible where God is powerful like that, but we also have a God that is close, that whispers, that comes close to us. God's bigness and God's nearness. One thing that kind of never ceases to amaze and kind of baffle me is this closeness. I'm kind of okay with God being big and strong and mighty and destroying his enemies, and this idea that God is amazingly powerful and so different and far away from us. And sometimes that's kind of all I get distracted with. Sometimes that's all I see God as. I don't know about you, I sometimes fall into the trap of kind of only allowing God to be big and showy and extraordinary. But time and time again in my life, and we see stories like this one in the Bible, God actually comes in close to the small, to the whisper distance. In the Old Testament, we have this story. We have, the people were led out of Egypt. There's this kind of fire in the sky. There's clouds that God is causing. The sea opens up. God provides food. There's this big kind of miraculous acts. God is big and powerful. And God reminds us in stories like Job and in this Exodus story and countless other stories about his awesome bigness. He reminds us that we cannot put him in a box. And then a few chapters after this kind of Exodus story where God has freed his people, God literally makes his presence known in a tent, in the tabernacle. God literally climbs inside a box and comes close and dwells among his people. The God who cannot be put in a box voluntarily comes close and gets in a box. The God who can cause storms and thunder and fire and earthquakes comes as a whisper, comes close. And we see the same thing in the New Testament. The God of wonders and majesty becomes flesh in Jesus and draws close to us. And I always find this shocking and really kind of difficult. I think Elijah so wanted God to be kind of a bulldozer, a strong, powerful, God that shows up and, wins. But how did God show up? Well, he showed up as a whisper. He came close to Elijah. And the story continues, and Elijah kind of goes from this place having this encounter with God, and God kind of gives him the next part of the journey. And I don't want to focus on that this morning. I want to challenge us with the question of how do we hear God's whisper? How do you hear God's whisper? How do we allow God to draw close? How do we turn our attention towards the God that comes close? Well, I think Elijah gives one example. He was watching for the signs of God. He was waiting on God to show up. He could have been distracted by the fire. He could have, been thrown off by the wind. He could have run away from the earthquake. Sure, but he didn't. He stayed long enough to hear the whisper because he waited for God. He knew that God would move. And we had an Alpha Day yesterday, and some people came to, and we had a bit of time of waiting for God to speak, listening to God, listening for that whisper. And God doesn't always show up as a whisper, but God often in his mercy, like in this story, does show up and speak to us. And I wonder if just this morning we want to kind of try and be a bit like Elijah. Maybe there are going to be distractions. Anyone that's staying for the 10:30, there will be distractions in the room more than. This is quite civilised. The 9 o'clock's often quite civilised. There's no children screaming. But I wonder if, we want to just have a moment where we maybe have some stillness and we close our eyes and just practice waiting on God, waiting to hear God's whisper, waiting to hear God that wants to come close, the God that wants to meet with us in that kind of intimate closeness, that whisper distance.